Good evening. Welcome to the June 8th, 2020 special Troy City Council meeting regarding library funding. We'll call the meeting to order and ask for the roll call. Ms. Dixon.
Mayor Baker?
Here.
Councilmember Abraham?
Here.
Councilmember Brooks?
Here.
Councilmember Chamberlain Kranga?
Here.
Councilmember Erickson Galt?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Hamilton?
Here.
Councilmember Hoderick?
Here.
Okay, all present. Next up is public comment. Madam Clerk, is there public comment that was submitted through our two methods for public comment this evening?
Yes, Mayor and Council, we have 5 comments that were received before the 4 p.m. Deadline, and we have 1 comment that was received by a few members of Council after the 4 p.m. So if you would like me to read that one, I would need a waiver of the rules in order to do that.
To waive those rules, do you need an actual vote or can you do it by consensus? I can't remember.
We've been doing a vote to do that.
Okay, well, I'll make a motion to waive the rules to allow that additional public comment that was submitted to some council members after the 4 p.m. deadline and not to the public comment email address.
Support.
Moved by the chair, supported by Mayor Pro Tem Hamilton, that we waive the rules to allow that additional public comment read into the record as just stated on the record. Any discussion? All right, the vote, Ms. Dixon?
Mayor Baker?
Yes.
Councilmember Abraham?
Yes.
Councilmember Brooks?
Oh, where did she go?
I can come back to her. Oh, wait a second. Councilmember Chamberlain Kranga?
Yes.
Councilmember Erickson Galt?
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Hamilton?
Yes.
Councilmember Hoderick?
Yes.
Motion carries, assuming City Attorney Bloom or City Clerk Dixon in the middle of a vote when one of our members disappears. What is the proper procedure for that?
I'll mark her absent for that vote.
Okay, so motion carries. So,
Okay.
there you go.
First comment is from Bill and Joyce Ryapel. I live on Kings Point Drive. My house backs up to the new development. It seems that the new homeowners have no regard for the nature and preservation area. As I sit on my back patio, I watch several homeowners continue to cut down the area that was our understanding was preservation and was not to be touched. We were also to believe that any trees that were left standing were to remain. Those are gone also. I am disappointed in the city of Troy, we have called many times, for not enforcing these areas. I realize a few trees were planted to replace what was cut down, but the continued cutting and destroying of our green space cannot be replaced by 3 new small trees. My hope is that this behavior will be stopped. Second comment is from Michelle Pleben, City Council. I want to say that I was very pleased to see the Troy Police interact in a peaceful and supportive way at the recent march in support of George Floyd and the limitation of use of force. I urge you to review President Barack Obama's 8-point plan regarding such limitations and reforms. I do not believe that our police force has a history of unnecessary use of force, but I believe a dialogue about any existing guidelines in place and any that might be needed would be helpful and informative to Troy residents. Comment 3, to the mayor of Troy and our council members. I'm sorry, this is from Renee Polzin. In light of the recent events involving the murder of George Floyd and the responsible officers, I'm bringing a request to your attention. I am asking that the city of Troy strongly consider outfitting body cameras for all on-duty officers and making sure they are activated at each police call response. I understand that audio and video cameras are utilized currently in police vehicles. I have contacted the police department and received an extremely timely response. I understand that these safety protocols and tactics are being looked into, which I appreciate greatly. As a concerned citizen, I'm urging you to keep this as a top priority when/as these safety measures are being looked into. I take great pride in knowing that my city is safe. I'm now holding the city accountable in making sure that all citizens feel the same. Comment 4 is from James Hamilton. I have resided in Forest View Village subdivision for 30 years. I am contacting you because the property codes are not being adhered to by some of my neighbors. 1, landscaping maintenance. I have contacted the code enforcement department and they have been effective in motivating some of my neighbors, but not all. 2, property appearance. Some homes in the subdivision have siding hanging off the house. 3, sump pumps. Many of the homes that have experienced problems do not correct the problem correctly. Instead of tying the sump pump back into the drainage system, they simply allow the drainage to spill into public areas. In the spring and summer, it creates a swampy mess. In the winter, it makes for a treacherous and sometimes impassable walk. Blight is a cancer. If ignored, it will grow. Some of the neighbors are new homeowners and need to be reminded of the standards of owning a home in Troy. If not kept in check, property and values will deteriorate rapidly. Thank you for your time. We appreciate your efforts. Comment 5 is from Sue Matthews, President, Friends of the Troy Public Library. Dear Council and Mayor Baker, the Troy Public Library has been a premier resource for the Troy community and beyond since it opened its doors. Its impact had been felt for years before, really, when the first members of the Friends of Troy Public Library held the first book sale to raise seed money to build the library. It has been my great honor to chair the board of the Friends of the TPL for over 6 years. In that role, I have become intimately aware of every aspect of the library, the building, and the constraints of the funding. As Troy grew, so did the TPL. The original structure remains, as well as the 1984 edition. What also remains is much of the original infrastructure and a patchwork of makeshift improvements. The HVAC system, the windows, and the electrical grid are at max capacity to support a building the size and age of the TPL, and that doesn't even begin to address the issues the building has had with water leakage and mold damage in the basement. As you are aware, the Friends of the TPL operate 2 shops out of the library. Our conditions allow the TPL to sponsor programs and events. Our contributions allow the TPL to sponsor programs and events for the entire library community, as well as to enhance some services. As the TPL budget has dwindled since the time of the independent millage, our role is more important than ever. However, I believe we are at a critical juncture. Simply put, the Troy Public Library not only needs but deserves funding representative of its impact, use, and value to the community. Not only should the council advocate for a renewal of an independent millage, but you should also be looking to an increase that will allow 7-day service and ample infrastructure maintenance. Ideally, council should consider a bond to build a newer, more serviceable building. Troy deserves to have a facility that matches the forward-thinking, well-educated, and technologically driven nature of our city and its residents. Thank you for considering my input on this important issue. I look forward to listening to your discussions and the work ahead to maintain and improve the Troy Public Library. The final comment is from Aaron Green. Hello, council members. In the past, many of you have heard me speak passionately about libraries. I've spent something close to 1/3 of my non-sleeping life in libraries, especially public libraries, and with the future of the Troy Public Library uncertain, I wanted to share my thoughts both personally and professionally. TPL is a good, TPL is a good library, but has been chronically underfunded, and our community needs to step up and commit to properly and permanently funding the city library at a rate no less than 1.4 mils to ensure the excellence that we have every right to expect from a historic cornerstone of our fine city. I grew up in Huntington Woods, and I spent most days after school walking across the small commons from Burton Elementary to the Huntington Woods Public Library, and on weekends, I'd often split my time between walking or biking to the public pool and then heading next door to the library or vice versa. And even when I attended Roper, I'd still come home, then bike to the library. When my parents divorced, my father moved, and we'd spend the better part of Saturday driving from library to library, Oak Park, Royal Oak, Baldwin, Bloomfield Township, and Troy, picking up items which either I couldn't or couldn't stand to wait for, interlibrary loan. Within a year of earning my undergrad, I started working at the Clinton Macomb Public Library and spent the next 11 years there as IT assistant, technology manager, and once I earned my master's in library science as a librarian. The year that I started dating my partner, who has lived in Troy for most of her life, the Troy Public Library came under attack, and even as a non-resident, I fought alongside my partner and others, including some present on the dais, to protect and ensure the library's future. I've seen and experienced the power and importance of public libraries firsthand, from the story times for children and their parents helping to build literacy, family bonds, and community, to providing materials, computers, and assistance with homework and school papers, as well as a place to collaborate with peers, to being a critical aid for everyone from lifelong residents to new members of our community from around the world, from job seekers to DIYers, and even the base community and even the base of operations for fledgling small businesses, and so very much more. Libraries, along with schools, are the souls of our communities. They support, defend, and enshrine the right to free speech and sharing of ideas, and more than that foundational piece, they help people to search, to think, and to dream. We need them as we have always needed them. They are physical embodiments of our freedoms as Americans, and we have a right to the services that they provide. Troy has an excellent public library, but chronic underfunding has made it extremely difficult and sometimes impossible to provide the level of service that this community has asked for repeatedly over the years. I have fond memories of that building from my youth, and even then, it was the least welcoming of all the libraries in the area. Troy is and should be a leader in this region, and yet we once again find ourselves fighting to keep this library's doors open. I could go into technicalities of funding and library organizational models permitted under state statute, but after reviewing the options and seeing how so many libraries operate both in the Tri-County region and around the world, I strongly recommend that the individual members of this council throw its support behind the adoption of a city library model with an independent board, or one as independent as allowed, appointed by city council and a director, and that we strongly consider funding the library via dedicated millage assessed at no less than 1.4 mils in perpetuity, so that we never have to ask, will Troy have a library next year? How old is that building again? Will it be open on Sundays when I'm not at work? Will I have a place where I can introduce my child to critical thought and open their mind to dream and to dream with others? Learning is lifelong, and libraries and our library help us to continue that process cradle to grave. Let's be the people who stood up and said the Troy Public Library will never be put in the ground ever. That is all.
That concludes those that have submitted public comment in accordance with the procedures we have set up for these virtual council meetings. As a reminder, to submit public comment, you can send an email to publiccomment@troymi.gov or leave a voicemail at 248-524-3302 up until 4 p.m. on the day of a meeting. The last two, Sue Matthews and Aaron Green, obviously the purpose of our discussion this evening is to talk about the library and library funding, so I imagine their comments will be taken in. With regard to some of the others, the second and third, Michelle and Renee, as it relates to our Troy Police Department and President Obama's plan and pledge, and obviously we're still working through, we've sought information from our police department, we're working on finding out their policies and procedures and where they are with everything before we can take a look at whether or not we need to make any changes. And we'll continue to do that. And to Bill and Joyce and James Hamilton, City Manager Miller, I'm not sure if those have already been addressed by some in your office as it relates to enforcement of code violations and such, and if not, would you please have someone follow up with them to find out more specifics?
Thank you, Mayor. I am not aware of either of these situations, but we will look into them and report back.
Very good. Does anybody else on council have any comments, or anyone from city administration have any comments in response to the public comment we received this evening? Seeing none at this time. All right, we'll move on to D, which is, we have one agenda item this evening. It's D1, library funding. And I guess I should say that in addition to City Manager Miller and City Attorney Bloom, we also have with us Assistant City Manager Bob Bruner and Chief Financial Officer Rob Malzik and Library Director Kathy Russ and Assistant Library Director Phil Quick. I think that covers everybody who's on here extra special with us tonight. And we have a presentation from city management, the library, as it relates to library funding. It's my understanding that tonight's not the night for us to decide exactly what level of funding we need for the library or specific language for any vote of the people. But I do believe that city management is looking for some direction as to confirmation of the type of funding source for the library, which they'll talk about in their presentation. And probably in the next steps, we'll look at maybe some community engagement options or next meeting options as well. If I misspoke, City Manager Miller, please correct me. But with that, I'll turn it over to you to start the presentation.
Thank you, Mayor, and good evening, members of council. And you are correct, you summarized our intent for the meeting tonight. I want to thank all the staff, including City Attorney, for contributing to this presentation, but there were other staff members such as Lisa Burnham in Finance, Public Works Director, who helped contribute and make this a good quality presentation. The second thing I want to note that I know and understand working here for 20 years that the library is very important to this community. And with that being said, my job being city manager and my staff, our job and our specific opinions aren't really what matters. What matters is that we work with city council to work with the community to identify our preferred outcome. And specifically, we're talking about the library. And when city council provides us the direction of what type of library they want, we will have to figure out how much it would cost to provide that library. And we would then have to bring forward appropriate language to do whatever we're going to do. And we're not predetermined at this time. So the point I'm trying to make is that there's a process, and we're here to help council and the community get to where they want, specifically related to the library this evening. And as the mayor noted earlier, that we are not seeking decisions. In fact, it's a study meeting, we can't do that. But most importantly, we need consensus for the funding model, which we'll get into. With that being said, Assistant City Manager Bob Bruner sort of spearheaded this overall presentation, and he is going to present that. There'll be time later for questions, and thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to Bob.
Thanks, Mark, and give IT a second to bring the presentation up on the screen for us. As Mark mentioned, this was really a joint effort, a lot of input from library staff, facility staff, and finance staff as well. So thanks everyone to help make this possible, and to Stephanie for making it more visually appealing than it would have been if left to my own devices. Next slide, please. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the way the library is funded currently, some of the future needs, which have already been touched on, funding options, and then next steps. Next slide, please. Next slide. So the Troy Public Library was founded in the city charter when the city charter was amended in 1963 to permit the establishment and maintenance of a library. And it was funded through the city's general operating millage up until the Great Recession. And in 2011, voters approved a dedicated millage of 0.7 of a mil for 5 years. And that allowed to shift funding out of the general fund and relieve some of the strain that's on the city's general operating millage of 6.5 mils. And that strain came about as a result of the Great Recession and declining property values. So currently, more than 90% of library funding comes from that library millage, and all other revenue sources account for less than 10%. Next, please. This is just a chart, a visual representation of that fact that most of the money that funds the current operation of the library comes from that property tax. Next slide. Unfortunately, the current millage doesn't cover the full cost of operating and maintaining the library. In the current fiscal year, the one that's going to end at the end of this month, the capital project fund funded renovations of $104,000 and a new roof of $1.2 million project. And if you look at the coming fiscal year, so fiscal year 2020-2021, expenditures are budgeted at $4.127 million. And if you do the math, that comes out to a little bit more than 0.7 of a mil. And what we're actually levying right now is less than 0.7 because it's been rolled back to the headly. So as a result, the library fund revenue is only going to cover approximately 90% of budgeted expenditures in the coming year, and the rest will come from the library's fund balance. Next slide, please. This is a visual representation of that fact. You can see how when the first library millage started in the fiscal year that ended in 2012, revenues were greater than expenditures, and the city was able to build up a little bit of a library fund balance, or a rainy day fund for the library, and that's that yellow line at the bottom. But as you can see, as expenditures exceeded revenue, more recently, the library fund balance has been spent down, and it'll be close to zero at the end of the coming fiscal year. And that little gray triangle, that's what expenditures look like when you incorporate that those projects that were funded by the capital fund. Next slide, please. So currently, in the coming fiscal year, these are rough numbers. I've rounded them for visual presentation. Our personnel costs are more than 50%, almost 60% of library. Probably comes as no surprise. That's the biggest expense in a lot of the things that we do is the personnel. Second largest expense is the collection, which is up near $600,000 a year. And computer services, nearly $500,000. And then lumped together, everything else is about $450,000. And then you can see the small darker blue sliver is what's being spent on the building in the coming year. And again, you've got the dollar amounts on the left and what that translates into mills on the right. And as was mentioned in the previous slide, it adds up to a little bit more than 0.8 of a mil, and that for the coming fiscal year. Next slide, please. So that's just to give you a little idea about current funding, what the situation is. Now we're going to talk about some of the shortcomings and future needs. Next slide. So hot topic of conversation is personnel, and specifically opening on Fridays. So before the Great Recession, the library was open 65 hours a week and had 7-day service. Service was reduced to 6 days a week in July 2010, and subsequently from 7 days down to 6 days, and from 65 hours a week down to 55 hours a week. Now, actually started research on this back in 2019, before the pandemic started and closed all the libraries. So back at that time, when we looked around at how the hours at comparable libraries, we found they were open between 58 and 74 hours a week, and the average was 68. So Troy, with the pre-recession 65 hours a week, was pretty consistent with what we saw in similar libraries prior to the pandemic. And this is, like I said before, the biggest variable cost in the budget. Obviously, more hours cost more money. Now, the second biggest cost factor, or I guess the cost factor that has the most variability, is building maintenance and how much money we want to spend on the building. So the original Troy Public Library, I should say, the original part of the building on the Civic Center campus, because there was library elsewhere before 1971. But that part of the library, now occupied by the youth area, opened its doors on the Civic Center campus in 1971. And then it was expanded to its current footprint in 1984. And I am assured that it is not hyperbole to say that, you know, we still have some of the original furniture from 1984 in there, and there are parts of the library that really haven't seen significant changes in 36 years. Kathy Russ, our library director, celebrated her 13th anniversary with the city last week, and said at the time that she was hired that, you know, there had been a study to do a new library facility at that time, but of course then came the Great Recession, and it didn't happen. And here we are now, 13 years later, without any significant changes to the library. So whether we completely replace it or renovate it, that, you know, there's a lot of choices in between. But obviously, we need a working, functioning building in order to have a library. No building, no library. Next slide, please. So this is a little more information about the hours that I mentioned. Shows what Troy Public Library hours were, specifically day by day, how that 65 hours was allocated. And so the biggest difference you see here, you know, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, we had 11 hours then. We still had 11 hours before the pandemic. Saturday and Sunday were reduced by 1 hour, but the 8-hour service on Fridays is really the biggest difference. And like I said, there's a lot of variability among similar libraries, anywhere from 58 to 72 hours. So in order to figure out, you know, how much does it cost to staff the library, we have to decide how many hours a week we want to be open. Next slide, please. So this is a calculation that only accounts for that personnel cost. And so the first row is our current hours, 55 hours a week, and our annual personnel cost, $2.428 million. And so that comes out to about 0.47 mils for the way that the library is currently staffed. And then as you increase hours by, you know, bumping the number of hours up to 58, or bumping them up by adding 7 hours of service on Friday, you can see how that number changes. Whereas if, you know, if we wanted to go all the way to the maximum 74 hours of what we saw in comparable libraries, it would be almost the entire, you know, 0.6 and change, which is what's currently being levied. So this is really just to illustrate the variability of costs depending on how many hours we want to be open. Next slide, please. So these are the parts of the budget that don't vary as much as personnel and the facility costs. Collection development is the process of maintaining the materials that our community members want. And this is obviously more than just books, in air quotes, a lot of all our electronic material and other things that people are taking advantage of. And this $600,000 number has been pretty consistent over time. Even if you go back to the pre-recession days, I believe was a little closer to $750,000 a year. And, you know, so you can bump that number up and maybe have more materials so people don't have to wait for holds as long and that sort of thing. But it's not going to vary nearly as much as the staffing costs or the building costs. But again, if you don't have a collection, then there's really no reason to have a library. So this is a part of the library budget that really needs to be funded. Then we've got computer services, about a $500,000 total, and then that other category of everything else. The, you know, exciting stuff like cleaning the building and paying for the utilities and that sort of thing. And again, you know, yeah, if we have more hours, there's going to be some additional cost in cleaning and some additional cost in utilities and that sort of thing, but not nearly as much variability as we'll see in the personnel costs or in the building. Next slide, please. So this is kind of just, you know, rounding up from where we are today. You know, what would it look like if we had basically the same personnel cost, 55 hours, just, you know, rounded up to $2.5 million. The collection budget, still $600,000. The computer services and everything else haven't made any changes there. But this represents a fairly substantial increase in investment in the building. So up to about or to $400,000 a year, which would be enough to not only chip away at a lot of the building systems that are aging, but also to, bring the building up to date fairly modestly and slowly over time, but wouldn't have to worry about it, any major building failures. And then just taking that $4.5 million number and translating it into the number of mills that it would take to raise those funds based on 5.143 billion with a B net taxable value. And that's the city's actual net taxable value for the coming fiscal year. And so $4.5 million budget in whole gets us up to about 0.8750 mills. Again, nothing magic to this particular set of numbers, just kind of an illustration of keeping hours where they're at and taking a step in the right direction with our building costs. Next slide, please. And now here we take it further. We go ahead and increase the personnel costs up to 68 hours and keep the facility investment at $400,000. So overall, it's a $5 million budget, and it's about 0.9722 mills. So this gets hours back to where they were pre-recession, and then some, and still modest investment in the building. But like I said, this is kind of illustrative. Nothing magic about these numbers. Not a specific recommendation. Next slide. So funding options. How do we fund a library? Next slide, please. How a library is funded depends on how it was established. And we want to go through and talk about these just so folks understand that different libraries in the area are funded through different state statutes. And the difference to the patron probably doesn't matter, but for those of us who have to think about these kind of things and make recommendations, it's important to understand some of the differences between the different ways libraries can be established and funded. Next slide. So the first one we're going to talk about is the Home Rule Cities Act, and that's because this is the way that the Troy Public Library was established. And I mentioned that it was established by when the city charter was amended. The Home Rule Cities Act is the enabling legislation for cities. It includes both mandatory charter provisions, things that every city charter must include, as well as permissible charter provisions. And libraries are permissible. City doesn't have to have a library, but it may have a library. And this particular statute does not provide for a specific tax rate. It leaves it up to each individual city and each individual city charter to decide how to raise the funds for the library. And there are certain limitations within the Home Rule City Act. So some of our local examples of libraries established this way are Dearborn, Novi, and Warren. And once upon a time, some of these, not these specific examples, but that some libraries may have been funded through their city's general operating millage, like Troy's was. But now most libraries established this way are funded through a dedicated millage, the way the Troy Public Library is. Next slide, please. The City, Village, and Township Libraries Act, Act 164 of 1877. So this one predates the Home Rule Cities Act. I don't want to get into a history lesson, but the way cities were established before the Home Rule Cities Act was different. And so there was a separate act to deal with how libraries could be established in cities, villages, and townships. And it allows the city council to levy one mill without voter approval and an additional mill with voter approval. And libraries established under this act are governed by an elected 6-member board, often called a board of trustees. And that board, not the city council, has exclusive control of the expenditure of the money in the library fund.
Can I make a quick comment there, Mayor, if that's okay?
Sure, Mayor Pro Tem Hamilton, go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. When I read the X-164, I thought this model had an appointed library board. The only one that had the elected by the people, I believe, was the next option you're going to show, which is the independent library. City Attorney Bloom, is that true? Is this X-164 elected by the people of the board, or is this appointed? Because the city council is the one in charge of levying the millage. I just noticed this. I thought that X-164 was an appointed board. Is that true?
Mayor, it is initially appointed, and certainly the key factor here is that it is an independent board.
Okay.
But, okay.
Kathy Russ, did you have something to say? Sorry, Assistant City Manager Bruner, we've gone off the rails a little bit, but we'll get back on here in just a second. But Kathy, go ahead.
I just want to mention, I used to work for the Bloomfield Township Library, and their trustees were elected. I believe that it does depend on how libraries are established, but most township libraries do have an elected board.
All right. We'll get back to you, Assistant City Manager Bruner.
Thanks. Next slide, please. So these are some of the examples. Baldwin Public Library, that's actually the library located in Birmingham, but it is named after a prominent Birminghamster whose name was Baldwin. And they also serve some of the neighboring communities through contracts. And they do indeed have independently elected library board members. Bloomfield Township, Canton, Rochester Hills, which I believe also serves Oakland Township and maybe a couple other communities through contracts. And then the West Bloomfield Township Public Library. And we don't recommend attempting to reestablish the library under this act, because really not sure that's feasible to do it in a timely manner. And frankly, I'm not convinced that there's really any benefit to it. And I've worked in communities, including Birmingham, who operate this way, as well as communities like Troy that are established under a different act, and preferably prefer being established under city charter. So next slide, please. District Library Establishment Act. There was a much older District Library Establishment Act before 1989. It's not that district libraries just came into being in 1989, but I think the statute was replaced at that time. And this allows 2 or more municipalities to form a district library. Examples are Clinton-Macomb, which is joint between Clinton Township and Macomb Township in Macomb County, Farmington Community Libraries, City of Farmington Hills and the City of Farmington, Grosse Pointe, or the Grosse Pointes, and Plymouth District Library, which probably includes the City of Plymouth and Plymouth Township, I'm guessing. And again, this is not a feasible option for Troy, because we need to find a partner community with which to establish a district library, and really not sure that even if we did, that would really provide any benefit, because as the largest city in Oakland County, we already enjoy economies of scale. Troy Public Library is already a Class 6 library, which is the largest class of libraries in the state of Michigan in terms of the number of people that we serve. But did want to make sure that City Council and everybody paying attention at home is aware of the different ways that libraries are established and funded. Next slide, please. So now that we have that primer, let's talk about next steps and where we go from here. Next slide. So the first thing is to choose a funding option. stick with the current funding and governance model provided by the Home Rule Cities Act. As I mentioned, it's not clear to me that we could do anything differently in time to fund the library in the next fiscal year. And it's not clear to me that any of these other options really provide any benefit compared to the way the library is established and funded now. And so unless there's interest in evaluating those options, it really comes down to determining what library millage rate and duration that the city council wants to put on the ballot for voter approval. And that is the next step is to approve the ballot wording before August 11th. And then the voters would consider that ballot question in the November general election. Next slide, please. So when we look at the millage rate specifically, I think, from the numbers that we've shown here tonight, you can see that the rate must be increased in order to prevent future service reductions. We're spending more money this year than the library millage is generating. Another important factor to consider is that the city council doesn't have to levy the maximum approved by voters. So if voters approved 100 mills for the library, the city council could just levy 2 if that was what the city council felt was necessary to fund the library appropriately. And we know that the rate will be rolled back in the future when property values increase faster than inflation. And so in the history of the last 10 years, that first millage of 0.7 of a mill wasn't rolled back initially because we were in a recession, coming out of recession. And so property values were not increasing faster than inflation. But between the time the voters approved the second 5-year millage and before it was actually implemented, it got rolled back because that was the Headley calculation at that time. So we need to take in not only the service needs, how many hours we want the library to be open, how much we want to invest in the building, but also looking down the road, trying to anticipate, what the rollback situation might be like in the future. So hard to, I can't predict the future, but these are the kind of things that we need to keep in mind going forward. Next slide, please. Now, so this is the millage term, actually, not the millage rate. I wanted to provide some data on what kind of library millages have been approved in Oakland County in recent years. And so the Library of Michigan has been collecting data on library millages for many years statewide. And I believe we distributed that document to City Council via email this afternoon. It's also available on the Library of Michigan website if anybody wants to look. It's millage results, I believe, from November 2010 to November 2019. And so just looking at the millages that have been approved in Oakland County since 2012. And I picked 2012 because prior to 2012, the Library of Michigan data does not differentiate between a bond question that would have been to build a new library or renovate a library, or an operating millage. So the table that you see on this slide here are just the operating millages and just the ones that passed in Oakland County since 2012. And you can see there at the top, Brandon Township in August 2012 passed a millage in perpetuity. You've got other millages. Only one other millage besides Troy was for a term as short as 5 years. See a couple 6s, several 8s, and a lot of 10s. And so the average term from these Oakland County communities is 8.7 years. So that's something else that the City Council needs to consider I think the conventional wisdom is that the shorter the term, the more likely voters might be to approve it. But that also puts us in a situation with shorter term millages where we're constantly having to come back and do this over again, and it makes long-term planning very difficult. So City Council needs to try to strike the balance there. Next slide, please. So with all that being said, you can see here the schedule of regular council meetings between now and August 11th. August 11th, that is a statutory deadline that ballot wording must be presented, certified to the county clerk. So our city clerk has to send a certified copy of the resolution to the county clerk no later than August 11th. That's not negotiable. So coincidentally, we do have a city council meeting the day before that. I do not encourage anybody to leave this to the last minute. That's not an invitation to wait until August 10th to finalize ballot language. But we've got 4 regular meetings between now and then, and we'd be happy to schedule additional meetings based on whatever direction council provides. So that's the presentation for tonight. We had a longer memo in the packet and some other questions and answers that council members submitted. So tonight we basically like to hear your questions and find out what additional information that you'd like before focusing on the term and the millage rate you'd like to see for a ballot proposal.
Okay, very good. Are we going back to the regular screen now? Is that the plan? Okay, I'll let them do that. There we go, very good. Okay, so thanks, Bob, for that presentation to start off. Obviously, I know I have a ton of questions, some that I had before, some that I wrote down as you were going through the presentation, and I'm sure several, if not all of us, have comments and questions and thoughts. And I think it's probably best to go around the table as we do to start with fellow council members, if that's okay with you. And I'll use the screen. So first up, I'm going to start with Councilmember Erickson Galt for any questions. I know you submitted some questions before. I think some of those are good questions that we might want to discuss a little further here. That's my editorial on that, but I will turn it over to you to start out.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm first going to go through a couple of the questions that came up in my mind as we were going through this presentation. First of all, Mr. Bruner mentioned a previous library study. I'm assuming that was for rebuilding the library, if I understood correctly. Is that still available? I mean, I'm sure it's very much outdated, but I would mind taking a look at it.
Kathy or Mark, so you both.
Well, I'll start off and then Kathy can chime in. Yes, there was a study and it was for new construction and library needs study. And if I'm sure we can find a digital copy and send it to council.
Thank you.
Kathy, did you want to add on to that, or sorry, Ann? No. Okay, very good.
That's fine. Is there any advantage to having a vote to set a millage in perpetuity, or conversely, any disadvantages to that?
I think the advantage and disadvantage is really political calculation. Longer term, perhaps less likely people will be to support it. The only other thing that I can think of is that as a millage rate is rolled back, if it's in perpetuity, you might have to make a choice at some point in the future to say, okay, we're going to actually have a heavily override vote on the library millage to readjust it. And by having a millage that's less than perpetuity, you're basically kind of forced to do that. So I don't see that being an advantage or disadvantage either way. It's kind of 6 one way, half a dozen the other. But I think the primary thing is really just, what are voters likely to support?
Okay, thank you. Oh,
Kathy, you're on mute. Okay, good.
Just to add to what Bob said, just in terms of practical reality in the library world, if a library has a millage in perpetuity and that millage no longer meets the library's needs, that's when you see service cuts. That's when you see libraries reducing hours. That's when you see libraries reducing their collection, their staff. They don't have any other choice except to, as Bob mentioned, go for that heavily override millage. So those tend to be your two choices: either go for another millage or live within your means.
okay, thank you. And then the other thing I wanted to, since we'd already started discussing the pros and cons of setting up library under an independent board under Act 164. One of the questions I'd asked in advance about, what other obstacles there might be to pursuing funding under that option. And I know I was given an answer, but if somebody could just, go through that for those at home listening so that we understand, what I'm hearing is that that's not really feasible. And other than simply electing or appointing board members, I'd like to hear why it's not feasible.
City Manager Miller, you want to start?
Yeah, when I want a clarification, when you say feasible, you mean, I'm not sure what you're asking about.
Yeah. I know there's issue about whether we could have a library board appointed or elected, whatever the case may be in time, to get everything in place. But I guess I would need to understand the process better of what all needs to happen to switch from our current funding model of just a dedicated millage in the library being under the city versus setting up an entirely separate library board. My understanding is there's a lot involved in setting up a separate library board. So if somebody could run through what are the many factors and the other considerations we have to go through if we were to go that route.
And if I can add on to that, just as part of that, the assumption is that it's not feasible now because we're up at the end of the previously approved millage, is my understanding, and we just don't, I don't know if we don't have the time to do something like that. If that's if that's what I'm supposed to understand, if you could just speak out a little bit, because otherwise, so when would you do something like that? Or should this process have started earlier, I guess, is the question. But we can't do hindsight, we gotta move forward. But anyway, you can add to that.
So I will add a comment. And one, I am personally not prepared to discuss, all of the steps that would need to occur. I don't know if City Attorney Bloom or Kathy Russ could, but yes, there is a feasibility of creating a funding model in a different way. But a lot of times it's done when it's first created. Now, I don't know if there are records of them switching, and Kathy may know. So I will sign off and see if anyone else has some more to add to that.
City Attorney Bloom?
Yes, I just wanted to add that really you're asking for a severance, a separation of this entity. And so things like leasing of the building space, things like hiring of the staffing, things like, any retirement benefits that have accrued, all of those things, the cost of the materials, how do you account for the materials? How do you do that transition and sever it from the city? Those are all things that would need to be figured out. And I think Mr. Miller is absolutely right. This is, it's contemplated that you choose the method of funding when you initially have your library. So transitioning a library creates some difficult challenges.
Kathy?
Actually, everything that Lori said was what I was going to say, probably with more detail, but I think she summed it up really well.
Yeah.
Yeah, just one additional clarification. Whether we went with a renewal or increase of a millage under the current scheme, or if we were set up a board, my understanding, either one of those options would have to be approved by the voters. We wouldn't be able to just set up a board without going to the voters and saying, yes, do you want to switch the library over to the system?
Uh,
Is that correct? City Attorney Bloom? Looks like you're contemplating.
Well, I'm not exactly sure. I mean, in order to get the funding, yes, you do have to go to the voters, unless you go through all of the steps to sever the library, and then council can impose a 1 mil without going to the voters. If you wanted to go above 1 mil, it would have to go to the voters. So hopefully that clarifies it for you.
Okay, so if I'm going to do some active listening here and see if I'm understanding this correctly. Theoretically, council could set up the severance procedure in order to create a separate library board without a vote in November on that issue. And then the only time we would go to the voters is if we wanted to impose millage greater than 1 mil. Am I misunderstanding that?
No, it's that's it. And you know, again, there may be some votes of the people that would be required. For example, depending on the lease, our charter does have a provision about long-term leases. So if there were a long-term lease, there's a possibility of a referendum. So I don't want to say definitively that no, it would never go to the voters, but yes, you are correct in that under the statutory schemes, that's what's provided for.
Okay, thank you. I think those were all of my questions.
I think I'm just going to state, and you can tell me I'm wrong, Councilmember Erickson Galt, but you're not necessarily advocating to not go to a vote of the people for something. You're just looking at the different options so we have a full understanding.
I'm not advocating anything this moment. I just want to have as much information as possible as to what our various options are, so that when we make our decision sometime well before August 11th, that we know what our various options are. I mean, from what I'm seeing, it does seem like a district library is not possible in any universe at this time, but I just wanted to clarify whether a separate library board is possible versus, not the best. I want to get more information. It's just all I want to do right now, and so we can all mull this over.
Very good. Okay, I'm going to drop down to Councilmember Abraham. Surprise.
Thank you, Mayor. I've been thinking about where we were 10 years ago, which is when I started to get involved in council meetings and budget sessions. And in many ways, we're in a very similar place. And in many ways, we are not. One thing that I find striking from our journey from 10 years ago in 2010 is all of the quality of life services their budgets were being reconsidered. And at the time, the Troy Historical Society picked up operations of the historic village. The Stage Nature Center was also going to be operated independently, again, all to take the pressure off of the general operating fund for the city. And in the instance of the historic village and for the Stage Nature Center, they managed the operating budget, but the capital always seemed to come from the city. And I find it very striking that in the past 9 years, where we have had the dedicated millage, the onus of the capital has been on the library until it's essentially its funding or its savings was essentially depleted or not sufficient to replace a roof for $1.2 million. So I guess my question is maybe more for city staff for clarification is it the expectation that this millage, and we're trying to come up with the right rate, must it comprehend the capital? Or is that something that the city can just assume as part of its capital funding?
City Manager Miller?
First, we're not presuming anything. We are seeking direction from City Council. And if, one, it's your desire that the funding exclusively come from the capital fund, that's okay, but there are consequences. And the problem is the capital fund cannot cover all of our capital needs in general, and it is heavily rolled back. So the simple fact is if we take dollars from the capital fund, which the general fund is contributing to, and CFO, can you chime in how much the general fund gives to the capital fund?
Right. In the current budget, it's $2 million. And in the 2021 budget, it's $1 million.
So understanding that if the capital fund exclusively funds the capital needs of the library, it is reducing what we can do overall. So in my saying that we're not presuming anything, I think from a tactical standpoint, fully funding the library with the millage would actually serve the city and its capital needs because it wouldn't be pressing the city's capital needs. But ultimately, we are going to take our direction from City Council and implement what your desired goal is.
Kathy, did you have a comment to that?
I just would like to make a comment from an operations standpoint. One of the things that concerns me always is that the library's funding is stable. So if the library's capital needs were met by the city and the city had some emergency, I think it follows that the library's capital might be cut. So there may be a year where the city may have to decide between some critical project that it needs money and some perhaps less critical project at the library, which might be less critical to the city, but not less critical to the library. So, from that standpoint, that does concern me a little bit.
Very good. Councilmember Abraham?
Yeah, the other thing I was thinking back when the library funding first became an issue in 2010 is the operating budget for the library in the mid 2000s was significantly higher than what it is today, and that wasn't paying for any of the capital expenses at the time. And if I'm not mistaken, Kathy, you can help me out, but I want to say that it was around 2006, 2007, that fiscal year budget, the operating fund of the library was over $5 million. And am I remembering correctly?
Yes, when I started June 4th in 2007. So the fiscal year turned July 1st. So for the 2007-2008 budget, that budget was $5.2 million. The collection budget at the time was $780,000, and the library did have more staff, more full and part-time staff members.
And certainly it was open for 7 days as well, which contributes to the higher operating costs.
Correct. It was a 65-hour per week, 7-day operation at that time.
Okay.
Mayor Pro Tem Hamilton, did you have to interject?
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, and to put that in perspective, that 5.2 million was in 2007 dollars, which with inflation with today's dollars, I don't have the figures, but it's probably 6-7 million we're talking in today's dollars, purchasing power.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Hamilton. That was precisely my point is, we're still not even at a funding level where we were 13 years ago. And then you take net present value into account, it's amazing we've been able to stretch the budget as far as we have and have had such wonderful services from the library. But, to me, we're at a very critical juncture in terms of how we want to fund this going forward, because I don't think we can get as much value as we have gotten for the sustainable future. I think we need to supplement a little bit more. I'm not committing to any millage rate at this point, but I think to me it's very clear that 0.7 mils, whether it's for a 5-year millage or a 10-year millage, it's not, to me, it doesn't feel sufficient. And I guess my last question, and this might be more of something that we need to come back to after all the council members have asked their questions, is how can we engage the community? I think I have an opinion of what I think the library could be or should be, and it's based off of 10 years of having been heavily involved in this issue and being on council. But I'd really like to get some engagement sessions of some sort with the community, or get a finger on the pulse of how people truly feel. And I don't know if city administration has any proposals for tonight to talk through, but I feel like we really need to get our resident input on this.
City Manager Miller?
I agree with you fully, Councilwoman. And the one thing I will note that we will give some thought what we can do with where we're at with the world with social distancing. But Assistant City Manager, can you advise council on the upcoming agenda item regarding survey?
Yeah, we have talked on and off now for several months about a community survey for both residents and businesses. And we're bringing a recommendation to council next Monday at the next regular meeting. Unfortunately, I don't anticipate that would have anything in time for the city council to help the city council prepare ballot language in August. But it is our goal to implement a community survey in time to have results for a new and improved strategic planning session, this strategic planning process this fall. So, in the short term, it's difficult to know what's possible between now and August, but we are working on a longer term solution.
Do we have any concept of, and I think the answer is no, we don't have any concept, but I'm trying to figure out, originally this meeting was supposed to be at the library, open to the public, and I think we probably would have had a decent turnout, as if COVID-19 never existed, right? And I mean, do we have any thoughts on, in July, our expectations of what the state of our state will look like as it relates to indoor gatherings with social distancing? And is it worth having some kind of even another special meeting that allows for public input? Kathy, I'll get to you in a sec. That allows for the public input, and I don't like to use the word town hall because I think that gets overused and has a negative connotation, but a town hall so that we can get that pulse that Edna's talking about. And also, I mean, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I'm loath to be having these conversations through a screen without having conversations with people and without having people actually remembering what it's like to be at our library, to be in that facility, just to see the smiling faces, that they're helping them, to have their kids running around and they're using the materials, using the workspaces. So it's really difficult for me to say, okay, we're doing all of this, but I feel like we're masking everything because we have to under the circumstances. So sorry, now I'm editorializing. What I was asking is actually a legitimate question about our thoughts on July using the facilities. And I mean, I know we've talked a little bit about that at our last meeting, how we're going to do our meetings, but Kathy, you had raised your hand right away. Did you have a comment on that?
So I was on the governor's task force to reopen libraries, and a lot of it mimics what's going on in restaurants, but specifically for libraries, the guideline is if you have 50,000 square feet or more, you can have 4 people per 1,000 square feet. So if you take a look, and it's actually usable or customer square footage, so not staff areas. So the library is about 50,000 square feet, and that's the total building. So under that formula, we could have 200 people total in the library. And that's, that's part of the reason why the library is not open yet, because when you factor in the number of staff who are there during the day, that number declines from 200. So the meeting room under pre-pandemic conditions seated about 100 people. Under today's rules, we could probably have about, what, 10? So, indoor gatherings are limited. Outdoor gatherings have a higher number. I don't know if an outdoor gathering if this topic is conducive to that, but I don't see the library being a place where you could have a large gathering of people indoors for at least in June and probably not in July either.
What about the community center, Mark? Do we have any guidance on how, because that can open up, we can open up more walls in there to allow for more distancing. Do we have any idea of how that could work?
Not exactly. I don't know at this time. But to add what Kathy was talking about, I think that we need to go back and think about different ways to get community engagement on the subject of the library, because we're not going to be able to put large gatherings together. We're just not going to be able to. And there has to be another way in which we can get information in, whether it's digitally, and I know that's not person to person, but I think we're stuck with the problem of social distancing causing, the difficulty of having meetings. So far, the governor has not opened up gyms to my knowledge. Have they? Yeah, so it kind of is what the community center is. So we're waiting for guidance.
Okay. Councilmember Abraham, did you have anything further?
No, those were my top questions. Thank you.
Next up on the roulette wheel of fun will be Councilmember Hoderick.
My key questions were asked already, but there is often the question that comes up, and I saw that Councilwoman Erickson Galt sent in the question, and it actually came from the resident. I think there's an assumption out in the community that we have, again, some sort of rainy day fund that we can tap into for the library. And like Councilwoman Abraham, I think back to the original times when we were looking at how to set this up for the library and do a millage. That was the discussion then as well. And the bond rating became a factor that we needed to take into consideration then, and even when we renewed the millage 5 years later when I was on council. And the fact that there aren't sufficient funds there to continue to run the library year after year after year from that balance. With a new CFO in place, I'm thinking it's part of our study collectively as a council. I think various members, we have various levels of understanding of that. And I know when I ran for council, people talked a lot about make sure you protect that bond rating, and that AAA bond rating is a very special thing. Here we are in a point of consideration where we need to take that into consideration. And I was wondering if our CFO could maybe comment on that, explain that, so we help the public understand from the get-go, how we have to factor that in, and that we also do so collectively as a council.
Sure. Yes, there is no slush fund per se that's sitting there. If you look at our budget that we just passed, I think Drew might have sent you those slides. We're at about 24% of an unassigned fund balance when the goal is to be at about 15 to 20%. Our 3-year budget has us going down to 14%. So there is no general fund money to tap. As it relates to what you said about the bond rating, yes, it should be protected. And with Standard & Poor's, they have 7 points that we get graded on. And one of them is our what's called budget flexibility. And when you don't have a fund balance, you don't have budget flexibility. So to protect that bond rating, we do have to have over that 15 to 20% unassigned fund balance.
Thank you. Assistant City Manager Bruner?
Thanks. I just want to add one thing, kind of a real basic thing about this is that, you know, when you have a one-time expense, you can consider one-time revenues, and that's what fund balance is. But for operations, expenses that happen year after year, you don't want to spend one-time revenue on operations. So that's something I think that can kind of get lost in this kind of conversation. If you want to have a library only on the days that it rains, then I guess, you know, you could use the rainy day fund. But I don't think that's what you want. I think you want a library no matter what the weather, and that requires steady income, steady revenue. You know, fund balance maybe for capital improvements. You know, those are one-time expenses. But right now, based on, you know, where we're at in the world and the uncertainty that is ahead, you know, I don't think that's something that the council really wants to plan on spending down fund balance right now, and put the library back in a situation where it was before the recession, where it had to compete with other priorities for funding.
Right.
Mayor, if I could I'd just like to comment. Along the way on council, my first term, maybe 2 or 3 years in, just for perspective, we did have an outside consultant come in and speak to us in a study session about this very topic. So for residents that are listening and wondering if, you know, they're electeds and these appointeds, if they're all, you know, speaking a truth on this, if that makes sense, he was very, first of all, complimentary of the city and how it has managed its finances to protect a AAA bond rating, and then was able to speak to this very fact and gave very specific guidance, very similar to what was just shared by Assistant City Manager Bruner, in that language that just explains the difference between one time versus year over year over year. So I just appreciate that being reconfirmed. And this was a consultant that had some sense of, you know, what the ratings analysts look for. And we can really be proud of ourselves here in Troy that we have locked arms so strongly to really, really protect that bond rating. And I think based on conversations I've had around the community, that's still something that folks would want to do. In terms of engagement, and I don't know that there would be an answer for this tonight, but I think that is very important that we do get input from the residents. However we proceed, I want to be in lockstep, and I want them, the people we represent, to feel that we are truly representing them. Yes, we've had lots of input over the years about what folks want, but boy, one more sense check before we send some language to the ballot is absolutely appropriate. And distancing may preclude us doing it, except for, you know, look at us meeting here tonight. If there is a way to use somehow social media, some sort of engagement, if we can get creative, I don't know what that looks like, or some sort of a quick hit survey, which doesn't really capture dialogue and input as much as I would like. Of course, we each welcome it individually, and I want to have time to be able to do outreach, but something just to think about, is there some way we can get creative and maybe look at that with them, you know, maybe a month and a half, not as if staff isn't doing a lot to be creative already due to COVID, but just something to consider.
I was going to ask along those lines before I seek consensus on this, but City Manager Miller, would it be feasible? I don't know how long it takes for, in this particular instance, for city management to maybe come up with a plan or potential ideas. I mean, we have a meeting in a week. That seems like a shortened period. If I were to seek consensus to maybe ask you guys to give us a couple different ideas at the next meeting, I worry if we wait until July, it gets farther and farther away. But I know the GoToMeeting has their webinar section, and I've been to a couple of where people are allowed to ask questions if they you can type them in like a chat basically. I know that those technological capabilities exist. Maybe in July we're allowed to have some in-person meetings, and I've said it before, and I'm sure probably everyone up here would happily give a few more hours several times. I mean, if they could, to be available to people to meet with them. Obviously, all of us have different schedules and different responsibilities, but I'm certain that we would be available. But you, as city staff, would need to be there for all of these things as well, because you carry a lot of the nuts and bolts. So, is it feasible if I sought consensus to ask you to provide us with some kind of some different ideas at the next council meeting? Is that something that you could do if I got 4 heads to nod?
Yes.
Okay, can I get 4 heads to nod? All right, good. Do you understand what I mean by that, Mark? I think you do, but I just.
Yeah, I think I do, yes.
Okay. And I mean, it could be online stuff, it could be in-person stuff, it could be both, and we don't know what July is going to look like, but we better have some kind of plan, because I think it's important to all of us to talk to the community about this and give them a better opportunity. Go ahead, Mark.
We may have some consultants who can help us out. We already have under contract. So we'll make a few phone calls and give you a report for the next meeting.
Thank you very much. Councilmember Hoderick, did you have anything else at this time? No. Next up, Mayor Pro Tem Hamilton.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, everyone, for this presentation and everything you put together. It was very informative. This is something I'm very passionate about. I grew up in Troy. I grew up going to this library a year after the renovation, or no, I was born in '83 and the big renovation was in '84. So I've been going to this library since I was 1 year old. So it means a lot to me. To put everything into perspective of the numbers we're talking, the different millage numbers you were talking about, to maintain our current level of service versus to expand to a 68 hours of service, which is what we had 10 years ago. If we did nothing and we let this millage expire, the millage rate that our whole city would levy would be 1.4197 mils less than what it was 4 years ago, 1.36 mils less than it was 3 years ago, 1.3 mils less than it was 2 years ago, and from the budget we just passed to the next year, 1.06 less than what it was if we did nothing, because of expiring debt that we paid off due to previous fiscal responsibility. So to maintain the current library level at 0.875, or to expand it to a full 68, which would probably be 1 mil roughly, we'd still have a lower millage rate next year than we do the next fiscal year than we did this year, because of other smart financial decisions of the city. So I think it's a great opportunity to, at the very least, I think 1 mil and to expand to 7 days, to me, is absolutely something we have to do. This is something our city needs, and I'm passionately a supporter of that. And I know a lot of residents have talked to me that we need a new building. Like I said, from when I was, the building hasn't had a major update or expansion since I was 1 year old. So, and now I have a 1 year old, so she would like a new building too. So a lot of people, what I'm saying is I would like to know what it would take for a new building. Maybe that's something we don't do this year. Maybe we need a little more clarity from COVID. Maybe we need a little more clarity of where we're going, because we were talking about fund balance and how we have 20 million in the general fund balance, but I've heard other municipalities assume that their state shared revenue and their gas tax is going to reduce in half, which would be a 10 million shortfall that we have to fill, and we might have to fill that for 2 years. So there is no general, especially given the current situation, the general fund is not an option for this. If we want the same level of library, we need to do 0.875 at the very least. And then that'll trickle down with future Headley losses. So we need some kind of a buffer to maintain this. So to me, 1 mil is, I know we're not committing to anything tonight, but to me, 1 mil is absolutely the minimum option. And it would still lower the tax rate for the city as well, even if we enacted 1 mil overall, because of other debt millages being paid off. So my question is, have we looked at capital expenses being covered by a bond? We have AAA bond rating. We have incredibly low interest rates. And could we at least start the discussion? Maybe it's something we don't do this year, but in the future, talk about what it would take to build a new library, what that would look like, what the different options are. Maybe that's a good target for the survey coming up to discuss. And I know we won't have the results from that survey by August 10th, which is the deadline for us to get something on the ballot in November. So I anticipate something like a new library won't be a decision made this year. And of course, that decision will be made by the people. All these options, except that one option that I have no interest in taking, would be a vote of the people. So my question, is have we thought about that? Can we possibly add that to the survey in different ways and maybe have a very, very basic vision of what different new library buildings would look like?
City Manager Miller?
Yes, we have, the CFO and I have talked about this in general, and we don't have any specific recommendations at this time. I certainly think it's a good question, and as the Headley reduces our tax revenues, it may be a tack to utilize the good rates. And Rob, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to this. I know we've talked a little, not a great deal about it.
Absolutely. What we can do is we can get with our bond counsel and get you what, a typical building might cost, and, with some debt schedules, and just using Bob's schedules that he put out there today, that cap, there's like, let's say a millage that's built in with 700,000 a year for capital. We can get a bond if we were to go down that path that would be part of that millage that would pay for that. And so it's very doable. There's option A of rehabbing the current building and option B of building something new, but it doesn't have to be decided today, because we can clearly have whatever we build into our millage rate, an amount set aside for capital.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem Elton, do you have more?
I think you guys did such a great job with all your questions and everything you covered. And I did like the point brought up that if we don't cover capital costs for the library with this millage, then those projects ever getting done is threatened. If this COVID recession continues, things are getting a little better, but if it continues and we have to prioritize, you could see this lose prioritization if the roads get really bad or there's other capital decisions. So if the people of Troy want to make sure their library is always there for them and their the library building is always ready for them, we really do need to make this a part of the library's exclusive funding, in my opinion.
Rob, did you have something? I saw your hand go up briefly. I don't know if you have something to add to that.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, Kathy had mentioned it earlier, and Bob and I had talked about this earlier in the week, is that you have to have it, in theory, all together in the library as one bundle, because when you then start saying at budget time, when we're comparing, do we buy fire truck X or police car Y against something for the library, that's where Kathy's concern is, and it would be my concern too, to have a fully functional library.
Thank you. Now, you were through for now, Mayor Pro Tem?
Yep, thank you.
Councilmember Chamberlain Krienga.
Thank you, Mayor. Like others on council, I wanted to just start by saying my own public library has made me who I am. It's made me a researcher, thanks to the investment of librarians who taught me how to research. So I believe deeply in doing all we can to support our Troy Public Library here. Many of the questions I had were answered as well. And what we were just talking about capital makes me think of a comment made by CFO Rob Malchik about how often with capital expenses that what gets prioritized is the infrastructure year on year that just has to be updated, and the bigger capital projects often those can get pushed aside. And so being sensitive of the different capital needs within the library, how we're setting aside money that can go towards that and doesn't get lost with other needs, and even when other infrastructure needs get prioritized vis-a-vis those other capital needs. So I think that it's good to be mindful of that. The comment I wanted to make, though, was going back to resident engagement. I was hoping that, and still do hope, there's some way that we could consider a quick polling of residents. And something I was thinking as an example, and I'd love input from city administration around what's possible and what's not in the short period of time we have. Because in general, as a researcher, I would not recommend putting in these library questions with a larger survey. In general, the larger survey, the less likely you may get all the data back that you need. And the shorter surveys are, the higher response rate you often get, and often the better data. And I know, for example, with the Troy School District, I think a couple of years ago, and again, different issue, it was related to the sinking fund, is they actually polled around different millage rates to see what was the appetite of residents, what did they feel comfortable in terms of supporting. And they took that to people before they ever put that on the ballot. And so wondered, is there a way, not a large scale, because again, I don't recommend putting this within a larger survey, but a very short, something, a quick polling, and whether that is done with phones or these days digital. A lot of advances in resident engagement is even around texting and getting folks to text back a yes or no to an answer. Not to say that this can be a yes or no answer, it's far more complicated than that. But I know that there's a lot of smart ways to get resident engagement. And of course, as a researcher, you never want to rely on one form of data. And I think that's what my fellow council members were also getting at is, I don't think you can just go on survey data. We also need to find a way to have those two-way conversations with our residents. And typically you would want to complement survey data with focus groups. Of course, focus groups are not easy to do in this environment, but wondering, is there a way to leverage our existing neighborhood association network that we have? And if there's a way to be able to reach out to each neighborhood association and partner with presidents to be able to do some sort of mini conversations. And I know that's a lot of work. And I know it's something that, we could take on, but at the same time, we need you. You have the technical knowledge as well. But to find a way to reach out to these different existing networks. And I also think of some of our committees, if there's a way to leverage, like our Global Troy Advisory Committee, knowing that Global Troy has been very active with the library as well, and knowing that diversity, equity, inclusion is very front and center in our minds, and the library's had amazing partnerships with Global Troy. I remember from when I served on Global Troy, Kathy Russ coming in and speaking on a number of occasions, is maybe there's a way to leverage those existing committees to have some sort of focus group conversation, even if it's by way of Zoom. But I know for me that, and I will try to think of ways that I can on my own take initiative in my neighborhood with our association to do something. But I would feel more comfortable moving forward, getting that input of residents, because I've always said that the decisions we make, I want those to represent, and for people to always have a say in those decisions that affect them deeply, especially at a time where quality of life, it's both a concern, people want that quality of life, but we also, as we saw in the data today in the news, we are officially, and we have been actually in recession since February. So recognizing that is on people's minds. And I think as we think about how we ask some of those questions too, is I know we've talked a lot about in hours, and we need to decide on the duration of how long do we ask for 5 years, or do we ask for 10 years? And kind of thinking about being able to talk with residents to think how they're thinking. I think residents think in terms of days, not necessarily, they want that 7th day, not always in terms of hours. So by listening to them and hearing kind of how they're approaching this, and especially in light of the economic circumstances right now. So I just, again, that's just kind of my final pitch is, again, to kind of think about that. And then the second thing related to that is we will have to also think very strategically about how we communicate, thinking about having FAQs and having fact sheets to talk about this. And I know that we had talked about that there was a hope, and the budget was approved, but I know hiring is on hold for there to be a marketing position, there to be someone within the library that could help support getting some of that message out. But right now, because of the unknowns of the budget, that hiring would be on hold. And so wondering also how that would work. But I think that's down the road a little bit. But the hope was that I know that position would help get the message out around the millage and what needs to happen. So that's something also a little bit on my mind. So just some things to put out there.
City Manager Miller.
Kathy, can you help me? I believe you do have a dedicated marketing personnel, correct?
We do, yes. Jenna was hired, I want to say 6 months ago. The position, it was a part-time position in the library and the recreation department, and we were able to find someone and fill that position full-time.
Excellent.
And so correspondingly, recreation has a full-time marketing person too, as opposed to splitting, which became difficult. Each of us is a full-time job. But
Okay.
just quickly respond. We will put together a report and try to identify some ways to get input and engagement regarding this single issue, future library and how to fund it.
Thank you.
Listen, polling can be thrown together relatively quickly. I do know that. And it's certainly not a best indicator of people's true emotions and feelings, and it will give them often a binary choice, which isn't always good also. But it's not a bad idea to consider including some kind of polling of a couple of those issues telephonically or digitally, whatever makes the most sense and gives the best scientific data. I was thinking, okay, well, I'm sure Kathy has a huge database of emails, but you know what? That's going to get a bunch of library lovers to respond, which is not necessarily indicative of what the city as a whole looks like. So, and also to the homeowners associations, Cindy Stewart, I know, keeps a database and contacts with a lot of the HOAs in the city. And I know there has been at times, Sunil Sekri, who is now on the Global Troy Advisory Committee, he was the unofficial chairman of a group that used to meet. They tried quarterly for a while of all the presidents of those associations. I think that that's good for anecdotal information, as long as we were able to provide them in an email. Hey, could you run these couple questions out to your databases and have them send replies to us? I mean, I don't think that's a bad idea, but again, that's not going to be scientific data. That's going to be very limited, but it is a way of potentially reaching more and more people. As opposed to saying, hey, we'll be at the community center and then the same 30 to 50 people come, as we've seen in previous community engagement sessions. So again, that's not scientific, but that could give some options, and what might be something we want to consider as well. And certainly we could take those if we came up with a list of potential questions for people to consider, we all pretty much have social media and contacts. I think all of us pushing those out and seeking response will at least get some responses back as well. That would help give us some information if we're not able to go sit at a coffee shop with people and talk one-on-one for a while. That's just my 2 cents on that. But thank you, Rebecca, for those thoughts. And I think it's, we've talked about community engagement and all of these, the importance of that on this council, the previous council, but we tend to get stuck on what that actually means and how to best effectuate. So we have to the more we bring it up, the more it's likely to happen in a good way. So I appreciate that. Councilmember Brooks. Oh, you're muted.
Thanks. Thank you, Mayor. First of all, I just want to point out to everyone that just to remember that we have an award-winning library director in Kathy Ross and a premier library here in Troy. And really, if we want to maintain this level of excellence, we really have to invest in our library. So I think it's very important that we're having this discussion. So some of the questions that I had, so when we pointed out that, 55 hours would be, 0.875 mils and 68 hours would be 0.9722 mils, does that take into account inflation? And say, for example, if we increase the duration of the millage to 10 years, and the major cost is personnel cost, the cost of salaries can definitely rise over 10 years. So would that kind of take all of that into account?
Assistant City Manager Bruner.
So the numbers that I put together are pretty rough, and the millage rate gets rolled back when property values increase faster than inflation. So the way the property tax works is that there can be, basically inflationary increases, but oftentimes with personnel costs, they rise faster than inflation because of healthcare is the big thing. Now with the library, the vast majority of the workforce is part-time, so they don't have healthcare. So that's less of an issue when we're talking about this workforce compared to other parts of the city. But so it's a fairly simple question, not an easy answer. But the only thing that's kind of built into that projection would be, whatever inflationary increases that are allowed under Headley. But if personnel costs rise faster than that, then that would consume, more and more of the funding.
Kathy, do you want to add to that?
I just want to add, with the majority of the library staff being part-time, though we don't have to worry about insurance costs, what we do have to worry about, or I hate to say worry because that's not the right word, but when minimum wage goes up, that has a domino effect across the board for all part-time staff salaries, because you need to keep that gap between, say, the people who put the books away and the people who check out the materials. So that definitely has had an impact over as minimum wage has risen over the last several years, has had a very profound effect on our budget.
Yeah, so yeah, that was my question about that. And then also just for residents to understand that because of Headley, even if we, say, some people could say, oh, well, 0.875 mils is enough to cover, 55 hours or something like that. But it's very complicated because we may not get that full amount. And so it's just very important for them to understand that even if we vote for 0.875, it doesn't mean that over the next 10 years, that's what the library will receive. And so we'll be in the same position again and again where the library is underfunded because they're not really receiving that full amount of money. So I just think that it's kind of hard to understand that, for a lot of people because they don't, follow this the same way, that we're learning it and we're studying it. But I think it's important to really, really point that out. And then the other thing is with the millage that's kind of suggested, how does that count? Is that enough to kind of replenish the fund balance? Because we talked about how the fund balance is depleted right now for the library.
You cut off the last part of your question. You asked if
can you hear me?
There you go. Yeah, there you go. I think.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I think I'm having some technical issues. I apologize. What I was saying, I guess, like with the mills that are suggested, for example, the 0.875 mils for 55 hours, would that be enough to also replenish the fund balance? Basically we talked about how the library fund balance is depleted. So we obviously need to rebuild that up as well.
Assistant City Manager Bruner?
So the short answer is no. The numbers in the presentation, there was no piece of that pie for, rebuilding fund balance. And those numbers, like I said, are really just to kind of illustrate and give some ballpark ideas. The only thing that we can say about those numbers for sure is that if we could go back in time and levy that amount, for this coming year, that's what it would have yielded in the coming fiscal year. And if anybody can predict, what the future is going to be like, then none of us can predict that. So those numbers are really just to kind of give some ballpark ideas, but there's a lot of nuances like replenishing fund balance and minimum wage and other issues that anybody's guess is as good as anybody else's.
City Manager Miller?
Thank you. Councilwoman Brooks brings up an important point. A strategy to combat against Headley rollback would to authorize a millage rate. Okay, I'm just throwing things on the wall, don't quote me, let's just say 9 mills, but council, excuse me, not 9 mills, like 1.9. But let's just say 1.5, whatever. I'm not being specific. Council does not have to levy that full amount. If you look at like our water and sewer, we changed the rates. You could levy, but then over time, you could raise what you levy to fight off Headley reductions. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Rob?
Mark stole what I was going to say, but just as an example of that, sanitation by state law, it's a 3.0 mil, but we only levy 1.09 because that's what we need. So that would be an example that we are only doing, about a third of what the state allows for sanitation.
Yeah.
Teresa, go ahead.
Oh, the only other thing, I was also going to reiterate, outreach and just getting more input from residents as well. I think that'll be important in terms of making our decision. But those are most of my questions. One other question I did have, when we were talking about the AAA bond rating and that they take into account what the fund balances are, does that include the library fund balance, or is that more just our general fund balance that they're looking at when they look at the AAA bond rating?
So if the library is self-sufficient, then that takes it out of the equation. It's really the general fund that they look at when they're analyzing our financials. But if the library isn't self-sufficient and we're giving money from the general fund over, then that would be a negative that would be a draw on our bond rating in theory.
So essentially, we want a library that has a good fund balance.
We want a library that is self-sufficient for sure, at a minimum.
Anything else?
That's pretty. Nope, that's it.
Okay, very good. A lot of my questions have been asked, which is good. But of course, thought of a few more as we sit here. Just to pick up where Councilmember Brooks left off with the Headley conversation, to me, I've been on council for about 4.5 years now, and I still struggle with Headley and what it actually does and how it works. And I know that the general public doesn't understand, and because it's been yelled at me every year for the past 4.5 years. So I'm still questioning. But to me, I'm trying to break it down. I mean, to me, I look at this issue when it comes to the library funding and Headley. It seems to me that almost no matter what we do, because of Headley, the day that millage goes into effect, we already have less money than we planned on. It seems like kind of like when you buy a brand new car, the minute you drive it off the lot, it's already worth way less than what you just paid for. And so the practical way to handle that is to authorize more millets than you actually need, and only levy what you do need now. The political aspect of that is a nightmare for this city and for all of us. I'm going to say it as it is because I really believe that. And absent the opportunity to have meaningful and effective engagement and education on that, I would be very concerned about trying to reach for something that we could authorize up to, even if we don't plan to levy that amount, because that could put us at risk. As I look at Councilmember Hoderick and Councilmember Abraham, who still, as they refer to, have the PTSD from the first round of the library issue, I don't want to create that kind of situation where it looks like we're trying to grab more than we need, even though we're not planning on using it. And I know politically, if we look at the RTA millage, for example, they were talking about levying up to or authorizing a certain amount, but they at least claimed they didn't intend to actually levy that much. But I know one very specific group was saying, no, they're going to take all this money. So I just don't want to see that happen. But I don't know how you fix that, because it is a Headley problem more than anything else, as I understand. That's a comment, not a question. Another comment is, I'm not really convinced that an independent library board is not the best option for the city and for the library. But because I think there are benefits to it. My concern again is our time frame and where we are. That seems to kind of tie our hands a little bit. And there are complications relating to it because it is not a new library that we're setting up brand new. It's a severance agreement and such, and so that does complicate things. But if we could get a little more information about some of the specifics of that and what it would look like to follow along with Councilmember Erickson Galt, who started this discussion feels like ages ago now. We, that would help me at least have a better feeling of maybe something we address later or not. But in my experience over the past few years, talking to Kathy and talking to city administration and residents, there's still a strong amount of people that think that is the better option for our city, even if there's some messiness in getting there. But so I think it would behoove us to have a little more information. My other questions are kind of more about, I think that coming up with a rate obviously is difficult. We're not tasked with doing that tonight. We've seen the numbers that you've presented. They are, none of the slides that you presented or nothing that we've looked at over the past couple of years has shown us that what our current millage rate is actually paying for the library that we have. So I think it's a misnomer to say that what we have now is anywhere near sufficient. And I know that most of us on here, actually all of us on here don't say that, but a lot of the community do. I think during the last campaign cycle, it was even said, we stick with what we have and make do. Well, that the assumption there was that we were operating everything with the library with that money, and we know we're not. At one point we just spent $1.2 million on a roof. There are things that are way outside of that I'm not sure, again, from a public education standpoint, people of Troy really understand. And part of that is because Kathy does such a great job running a library that's award-winning. She's award-winning. No one's seeing her sweat out there working hard to try to make do with what she has. She makes it look too easy, which is difficult when you're trying to change things a little bit. So I guess, Kathy, I'm saying sweat a little bit more. And also, I just have to say, Kathy, for a librarian, you should really have books behind you when you're on these, go-to meetings and Zooms. I'm a little disappointed, but back to the reality here. The couple questions were asked about a new library building and how that works. Obviously, I don't think we should be trying to put something together like that by August and dealing with that. But I am curious, and I don't know if you can remember these, but I'm curious what the neighboring libraries and the other communities around us, their average age, how many of them have built new libraries, how many of them have done major remodels, and if that is something that, it would be good information to have as we look forward. And in that same vein, with that same issue is, if we looked at the capital expenditures we've spent out of our general fund to maintain the library and to do repairs, what those add up to and what that would look like in comparison to debt repayment plans on a bond. I think that would be interesting as well. Former mayor used to talk a lot about throwing good money after bad. And while we didn't always agree on stuff, that's something to consider in this specific instance. It would be nice if we're going to spend, hundreds of thousands of dollars each year. Maybe it makes more sense to do it on a newer building. So something to talk about there in the future. We've talked about community engagement. Obviously, I've been a strong proponent for a 7-day library. I brought something a couple of years ago in that regard to, and even suggested using general fund dollars to supplement in the meantime. I see the error of my ways on that at this point. For a divided council back then, that sure unified all of them to say, no, Ethan, that's a bad idea. So, it's amazing how that happens sometimes, but I do want the public to understand how just because we have an unassigned fund balance, it looks like there's a lot of numbers somewhere, or we see a big, $67 million budget, it doesn't mean it's wise to take that money and even use it towards operating costs of the library. That will only hurt us in the long run, and it's not good for stability. It's not good for the city. So again, the more education we can do on that, the better. But I think that's it. I actually didn't have any specific questions that need answers now, other than the two that I asked about more potential new building. I think that the presentation is a good one. So Mark and Bob, thank you. And for everyone who worked on that. When I look at, we have a meeting next Monday, and you've already agreed to provide some additional options on what we can do. I see concerned faces, so maybe my technology is not going well.
Mayor, it's in 2 weeks. The meeting is in 2 weeks. Just wanted to clarify that.
Oh, thank you. Okay, good. Well, that makes things much better. So that is I don't feel, so you have 2 weeks then. But it'd be nice if we could, at that next meeting, have that report. And as a council, if we could agree to discuss what our next steps and what we need to do for, if we need to schedule additional meetings somewhere, a special meeting, or what we need to do. I think we should be prepared to do that. And in the next 2 weeks, take this time to process all of this information that we've received tonight. I'm sure we'll hear some from the public for those who have watched. I may be so bold as to just to throw a question out on my Facebook, looking for some input, just to see where people are going, with a link to tonight's meeting. There's still a lot of people at home who aren't going places, so they have time to look at these things and really think about it. But I appreciate all the work that went into tonight. I know it's been tough. Councilmember Hoderick?
There we go. The 0.7 that we are functioning with now, that was put in place, now it seems like such a lifetime ago, doesn't it, Councilwoman Abraham? I just want to point out that was a compromise level back then and was known not to be adequate 10 years ago. And it is amazing that our library director and the team, I'm looking at you as well, Mr. Quick, what you have done for this community during that time. And we do Band-Aid approach the building, the capital needs, it seems like, until we finally had to give up and take care of the roof. There's furniture there 36 years old. That is not representative of this community.
This conference will now be recorded.
Of this community. So I just really want to point out that from the get-go, 0.7 wasn't adequate at all. And what we want to understand from the community is, what do you want your library to look like? What do you want it to be? I remember knocking doors 2 years ago, and I had some pretty strong input. I'm wondering if that input is still the same. And that's what I want to sense check. It's not that I don't know based on that experience, but I think given everything, that input's going to be valuable. But I think it's really important to understand 0.7 was never, ever adequate, and it certainly isn't now.
Mayor Pro Tem Hamilton?
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, to piggyback on what Councilmember Hoderick said, you can actually on the on the city website under City Council Archives, you can look at the presentation from 2015. I did that a few days ago, and you can see them discuss in that same presentation how 0.7 wouldn't be enough, and that there would be exactly what happened, which was we had to cover through general fund capital expenses. So she is completely right that 0.7 was a compromise, and it wasn't enough. Now, I do have one more question to also what Mayor Baker mentioned on looking at what an independent library board and an independent library organization would look like. My concern and question with that is, would there be additional administrative costs? Would they need their own financial department? Would they need their own, personnel department, or would they just contract with the city? I mean, those are the kind of questions that add a degree of complexity. And so the city being the admin for it adds an economy of scale. And I worry that an independent board, I guess we'd have to look at how the other independent boards in different communities work and how that works, but I'd be curious to see what that looks like. So Director Russ.
Kathy, do you have a comment to that?
So I think that the word there is independent. So if the library, Troy Library, Bloomfield Township Library, Rochester Hills Public Library is independent, it is its own operating entity. So therefore it is responsible for all of its services, auditing, bookkeeping, financial. It sets up its own personnel policies. It sets up its own benefits, its deferred compensation. The board hires the director hires the staff. I think one thing that's really important to consider is, so I work for the city of Troy, but if I said, you know what, I'm done, I'm gonna go open my own independent library, the Kathy Russ Library. I don't get to take the computers. I don't get to take the collection. I don't get to take the furniture in the building. I don't even get to take the staff with me, and I don't get to take the library's customer list. So if you want to think about it like that in terms of a business perspective, the library, if it's an independent library, the library is then responsible for everything. One of my concerns is that with the fund balance being so depleted, if the Troy Public Library became independent in the not too distant future and something drastic happened in that building, the newly independent Troy Public Library would be responsible for paying for it. Right now, like with the roof, as a department of the city supports, you know, the library and helps the library because the library is a member of the family. To have that newly independent library go out on its own with really relatively, you know, not a lot in the fund balance, and that would be another question. Maybe City Attorney Bloom could answer that. Would the library even get to keep what's in the fund balance? Because again, it's currently a department of the city, but if it leaves, it's not. So those are just some of the complexities, you know, for myself. One of the things that I think about is the newly appointed or elected board would hire the director. That's not necessarily me. And so there's that transition time where all of those things have to be put in place. And, you know, I don't see how it could happen in 2 months. And there would definitely be that transition time where, for example, for IT equipment, would the library contract with IT, the city's IT department, for a year and then provide its own computers? You know, but the money would have to be there to do that. So all of those things, I mean, that is truly just a drop in the bucket of the things that would have to be addressed in order to make that happen.
Thank you, Kay. I'm all set. I think we lost the mayor here. Okay. Well, I think I saw Councilmember Erickson Galt raise her hand, so I'll move for her.
Oh, there he is.
Yep. Is he coming back?
Oh, no, we can't hear you. You're muted.
I'm unmuted now, and I'm sorry. I don't know what happened, but I just lost all things. So I'm on my phone, but I'm back. Sorry. I heard Kathy disappear, and then I saw Councilmember Erickson Galt raise her hand. So is that where we were?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Okay. Oh, okay. So one thing that came to my mind when we were talking, we talked a lot about citizen input, and we talked a little bit about marketing. And I think that no matter what we eventually decide to put on the ballot, it doesn't mean anything if the voters don't approve it in November. So that's going to require not just citizen input, but citizen education on all of these issues that we sort of know. Some of the people on this call know really well, such as Headley, such as maintaining the AAA bond rating. I thought it was an interesting observation that CFO Malchek made about if you don't have a library, that if your library millage doesn't fully support all of the library operating costs, that's actually harmful to our bond rating. Perhaps not enormously harmful, but it's a negative. It's essentially a negative on our credit. And so what maybe this is a huge thing that can't be answered today, but what can the city, the library, and the city collectively do to try to promote whatever we put on the ballot and educate the public about not only the fact that it's going to be on the ballot, but why we're asking for what we're asking for? I know there are some limitations in terms of what the city can say about it. So,
City Attorney Bloom, did you want to answer
Yes,
that?
I did actually, and I've been trying to figure out a way to say this today as well, and I think it is for the future. But we are bound by the Campaign Finance Act laws, and so we cannot, council members, we cannot use city resources to advocate for the ballot proposal. So it has to be neutral. we anticipate that we will be doing a brochure, a factual brochure that will set out some of the educational things that you have mentioned, Councilmember Erickson Galt. So that will be coming. Obviously, we want to get that out to the public. We want the public educated, but it has to be absolutely neutral and not biased.
City Attorney Bloom, if I can quick follow up on that, we all maintain our own individual social media accounts as well, which are not run by the city, not through the city's servers or anything, but certainly I have on there that I'm the mayor of Troy. Am I prohibited from advocating for a ballot initiative on that? Or how does that play out?
So it's a complicated issue, and it's one that I keep trying to get to provide some campaign finance and some prohibitions for election law. So I'd like to do a more detailed memo and maybe put that on the next agenda as well, just so that there is some clarity with what can be done with the election laws.
Okay, thank you. Member Erickson Galt, did you have more?
No, I just wanted to get that out there. So we started thinking, even though there's a lot more that our city attorney and others have to put together to understand that, I just kind of wanted to get us starting to think about how we can promote whatever it is that we eventually decide that we want to put on the ballot. And I think we lost the mayor. Oh,
no, I'm here.
Mayor?
Yeah, Councilmember Hoderick.
In terms of this discussion that we're having about independent or sticking with the current funding model, length of time and the rate to be determined, I'm already of the mind that sticking with our current funding and governance is what makes sense. And I don't know where others stand, but it's clear to me that the chaos that would ensue if we were to consent and give direction to try to do an independent library is not an efficient use of my tax dollars and staff time and energy. I don't feel the need to study that a whole lot more. I guess in terms of the direction we're giving to city management, in terms of what to bring back to us, it's pretty clear from this conversation that that's a non-starter almost at this point in time, at least to me. Maybe others disagree, but that's kind of where I stand.
I, just so you all know, cannot see all of you again. So if you'd like to speak, please go ahead and just go ahead. Because I can't see the full screen. I can't see everybody. So is there anybody else on council that wants to speak to that?
Mayor Baker, it's council member Ann Erickson Galt. I brought this up earlier because over the last several months, as I've been mulling over all of our various things that we can do to invest in and protect our library, I've been thinking about whether an independent board would make sense. And one of the things that's becoming increasingly clear to me is it's not a simple put the idea on the ballot and have the voters say, do you want an independent library board? That what I'm hearing today and through the answers to my earlier questions is there are a lot of things that have to happen first to make that possible. And it's just looking at it from my perspective, from a cost benefit analysis, the costs that would be involved, not just in terms of dollar costs, but time and energy costs, do not, are not outweighed by whatever small benefit we would get. And I also want to make clear, based on what I was talking about earlier, I think it's important that whatever we do ends up on the ballot in November. We want our citizens of Troy to buy in to whatever it is that we're proposing. So the idea that we would try to create a library board without first going to the voters just seems wrong to me. And I'm speaking solely on my own behalf, but I think that whatever millage rate we propose, whatever funding option we propose, it needs to go in front of the voters, and they need to be able to be the ones to say, yes, we agree, that's what we want to see happen, so that we can invest in and protect our library. So
very good. I asked follow-up questions on that as well. I certainly have heard the information tonight as to why it would not be a great idea, and certainly with the timing. So I don't know if there's a requirement to have any, not knowing what other council members think, but to tie it up with a bow a little bit with a more definitive paragraph of some of the potential problems, that might be a nice thing, at least to have in an email. But I agree. I think using city resources, for you to go out and to do a lot of heavy research is for that, when it doesn't seem like it's feasible right now, isn't a good use of our tax dollars. So take that direction as best you can. If that makes sense. But anyone else on council have any other comments or questions at this point?
Yep. I don't know if you can see me, so.
You're the only other Mayor Pro Tem Hamilton. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm with Councilmember Hoderick. I'm probably 95% of the way that we shouldn't be changing things too much regarding the independent library board. I with minimal usage of staff, I would like more answers to, if we could find out how the other independent library boards, how their experiences, and I know that most of them were created that way originally, so it's kind of not an apples to apples comparison. But yeah, I am kind of curious what it would look like, but I understand the point that putting city resources to that probably isn't relevant to this discussion, because I'm pretty sold on, we need to just try to keep the structure as it is, and let's get the funding level and the investment where it needs to be.
Anyone else?
This is Councilmember Brooks. Yeah, thanks. I had one question. Councilmember Erickson Galt brought up a point. She said if it doesn't pass. So what would be the consequences if this initiative doesn't pass?
Who would like to handle that? I know an answer, but I don't know who wants to give it. So.
Mayor, I'll start. I mean,
right.
It would mean that, one, that there's an uncertain future for funding of the Troy Public Library. There could be other opportunities and other election days to bring forth other proposals, and that kind of did happen back in 2010, was it, or there were 2011. So then there would just be this round of potential election issues. It also could be the impetus of creating a district library then, who knows? I mean, but if the library doesn't have funding.
Is that good enough, Councilmember Brooks?
Yeah. Oh, go on, Councilmember Hamilton.
Oh, yeah. That's right, you can see me. Okay, sorry. Yeah, I mean, to put it in other words, we would probably have to close the library. I mean, if we didn't have the dedicated source, I mean, the near-term future of the library would be closed. And maybe a future millage could be passed to bring it back, but then you would have all kinds of costs to close it and costs to bring it back. That would be even more than what we would do by just maintaining it. So to me, it would be catastrophic for the community if we lost that. And so it is important that whatever we put on the ballot in November passes. Because the next election would probably be a weird off May election to barely get us in time for the new fiscal year to get the funding in. So it would not be good.
All the more reason for us to focus on getting good ballot language that can support the community, I think. City Manager Miller?
I will tell you that our staff, and I know Kathy has lived through this, our goal is to work with council to have a proposal that funds the Troy Public Library, and hopefully for a 7th day also be approved in November. Kathy and I have many discussions about this. It's a stressful time, and we believe that the community will continue to support the library, and we have and work in that aspect, because the last thing that all of us want is to live through that turmoil again.
Well said. Anyone else on council?
Oh, Mayor Baker. This is
Yeah, Councilmember Brooks.
Sorry. One other clarification I wanted to ask with Attorney Bloom. You stated that we could not support the ballot initiative on our social media platforms, but we can support the library and say the wonderful things about the library, but we just can't specifically speak to the initiative itself.
Yeah, I would urge caution. And again, I hope to bring something for the next council meeting. But it's the use of city resources that is the dispositive question. So, education is something separate, and as long as it's neutral, that's allowed, and you can use city resources for that as well. But again, I would just urge you to just be cautious with what you're saying at this point in time.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Okay, well, I think we've had a good discussion this evening. A lot of good questions asked, a lot of good answers given by city management already. Again, I thank you for coming to this meeting with such good information and working with us to work through some of these issues. I had said earlier to somebody that this council, other than Councilmember Hoderick, who voted to put the reauthorization language on in 2015, the rest of us have never experienced that aspect of it. Certainly others of you were very active in promoting the library millages early on. But this is it's a whole new council in a sense, dealing with this issue in a much different way. So I appreciate all the time you've taken to give us information, and I know it will continue. There's no other business for this evening. So with that, this meeting will be adjourned. Thank you all. Good night.